Live button. All right, we should be live. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my embrace family, and welcome to our weekly Wednesday online discussion. First of all, before we get into the discussion, I just want to say happy first day of Dhul Hijjah to everyone. As all of us know, these first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah are the most blessed days of the entire year. So I encourage all of you to utilize this time during these next week and a half utilize them very wisely and utilize them for remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, really focusing on strengthening your relationship with Allah. May Allah make these next few days the most blessed days for us, inshallah. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So as most of you know, we finished our book, The Evolution of Fiqh, with Dr. Bilal Phelps just a couple of weeks ago. And last week, we started to discuss a new book, which is not a religious book, but despite that, it's still a the book discusses something that's very, very important. And this book, of course, is The New Jim Crow, written by Michelle Alexander, which discusses the issue of mass incarceration and the war on drugs, which caused a type of systematic racism, especially towards black men. So last week we just kind of discussed what the book was about, why we're reading the book, and also where you can purchase the book, because we want to have this weekly Wednesday discussion, unlike the last book, which is more of like a class setting, for this to be more of a engaged collective discussion, right? Kind of like a book club. And now previously I mentioned that we're going to start with the introduction of the New Jim Crow today. However, as most of you saw from my post today in the reminder, instead we're going to be speaking about the preface that can be found in the 10th anniversary version of the book. So last week, you guys saw I had this book with me, which is like the quote outdated unquote version, and I discovered that the New Jim Crow actually has a 10th anniversary version. And when I purchased it off of my Kindle here, and while the literature of the book is essentially the same, so those of you who do not have a 10th anniversary version, don't worry, you'll be fine. There is a 2020 preface in the beginning of this book, which essentially gives us the author's perspective on how things have changed between 2010 and 2020, answering some questions that some people may have in regards to the focus of the book, and really just kind of giving us perspective of how we should approach reading this book in 2020. Because after all, as I mentioned before, this book was written back in 2010. So many people may be thinking, why are we reading a book about issues in 2010 when we're now here 10 years later? A lot of things have changed. The social, racial dynamics have changed somewhat. Certain policies have changed. So does this book still have relevance? And so that's why I think it's good for us to kind of just go over the 2020 preface in order to give us that perspective and allow the author to kind of explain to us how her perspective has changed and why she still believes that this book is not only still relevant in 2020, but perhaps even more relevant now than it was back when it was published in 2010. But before that, I just have a quick question for those of us who are in the chat. Is there anyone else who has the 10th anniversary version of this book? Or does most people here have the previous version?
I think I just downloaded like the Kindle 10th anniversary version. So I'm like trying to finish up the preface now. And I do definitely appreciate the fact that she has, covered the last 10 years, because that was my concern. I'm like, okay, so much has changed. And I think that, her addressing it, as well as talking about how, you know, it's the book itself is still relevant. I think we'll still get a lot of benefit from the book.
Great, great. Is there anyone else who got the 20th anniversary version, or is it just me and Sister Rashidah?
Assalamu alaikum, it's Sister Vina. I have the same version as Sister Rashidah, and I agree with her. And the beginning of this is absolutely amazing. So I'm glad we're going over it, inshallah.
Okay, perfect. So, Sister Vina and Sister Rashidah, I'm going to be counting on you two to fill any holes in my summary of the preface. Inshallah. So let's go ahead and
hold on. I don't know what I have because my daughter-in-law put it on the Kindle for me, and I don't know how to go back to like even get to the beginning of it. Like I'm in the book, and I haven't used the Kindle before, so I don't know what I have. But if we just download it, would I assume that I have the new one or probably the old one?
I think it depends on when your daughter purchased it for you. If you purchased it for you recently, then more than likely it's going to be the 10th anniversary.
Yeah, it was just last week when we decided we were going to discuss it. So
yeah, and you definitely have the 10th anniversary version. So
okay.
If you go to the beginning, you'll see the 2020 preface. In terms of how to use the Kindle, it'd be hard for me to kind of give some instructions virtually like this.
Yeah, no, I know the chapter, there was a lot of, you know, like introduction, or maybe you said it's called the preface. I don't remember what it's called, but.
Yeah, okay. Preface 2020. Like if you go towards the beginning, that's where you'll find it. And it's like about, I think, 10 or so pages that just kind of goes over how things have changed since back then and why. She makes a case for why this book, she feels this book is still very much relevant today.
Okay.
All right, so with that, let's go ahead and give a summary over what Michelle Alexander discusses in the Preface 2020. So to begin, actually just kind of give you guys a quick disclaimer. So today I discovered that Kindle allows you, you guys I can't see it through the camera, but Kindle allows you to highlight and take notes. I didn't know that until today, because I guess I'm just an old fart compared to young whippersnappers like Brother Daniel and Brother Jeffrey. So I actually wrote my own notes before I realized I could just highlight particular points I wanted to speak about in the book. So today I'm going to be kind of going through both sides, but inshallah next week I'll just mainly focus on my notes I have in the Kindle, inshallah.
Well,
that, let's go ahead.
That is a low, and I didn't know that either. So thank you for sharing that and letting me learn that.
Oh yeah, so Brother Daniel, you're an old man like me then.
SubhanAllah, 30 years young.
So with that, let's go ahead and get started, inshallah, into the literature. So to begin, she starts the preface with kind of going over what certain things have changed since she originally published the book in 2020. She discusses what things have changed and what things have not changed. So in terms of what has changed, she speaks about how over the past decade, there's been a more heightened awareness towards police brutality. When she speaks about the murder of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Eric Garner, Tamara Rice, young kid who was just killed within like less than a second by a police officer, John Crawford, Tatiana Jefferson, who was murdered here in Fort Worth. She goes over a variety of different individuals who are, of course, all African American who have been killed by either by someone like George Zimmerman or by police. So it discusses how these chain of events kind of reignited this awareness towards racial injustice, which in course in turn triggered more movements. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement. So she discusses that and how movements like this have raised a more national awareness towards this issue when compared in 2010, which of course makes sense. After all, 2010 was 2 years within the Obama administration, right? Or about 3 years, I'm sorry. I'm getting my years all, my things right now. Yeah, 2 years. It was 2 years within the Obama administration, right? 2010. That was 2 years within his first. Yeah,
that's right.
Yes,
right.
correct.
So 2 years within the Obama administration's first term, right? So at this time, of course, everyone was very ecstatic, very excited. This was, of course, the very first election, the very first election of a Black president. And due to that, this, of course, caused this misconception that racism, while it still existed, was no longer a huge issue. There wasn't really much awareness at that time towards racial inequality. But due to the different events that she speaks about, such as the killings of all these unarmed Black Americans, this kind of reignited that awareness and caused a variety of different racial justice movements. She speaks about at the same time, white nationalism has become more open than it was back then. We have, especially online. She discusses that mass incarceration has also become a more organized issue. She speaks about how there have been some bipartisan efforts to decrease to limit the amount of federally funded prisons and things of that nature. So these are some of the things that she speaks about that has changed in some good ways. But she also speaks about some things that haven't changed, that are still similar, that are still the same today as they were back in 2010. So, for example, she speaks about the politics of white supremacy, this us versus them mentality that was heavily utilized during the war on drugs, right? And she gives some examples, like, for example, how back then certain derogatory terms would be used to describe a particular group of people, such as crackheads, super predators, to where we have now, you see terms such as illegal, terrorists, and other groups of another type of derogatory terms of that nature. So while the focus on certain minorities may have shifted a bit back to when she was really doing her research, the strategy of divide and conquer is still utilized. And we see this, unfortunately, in the rhetoric of our politicians today, using certain terms, suggesting certain things about a group of people to give this idea that these people are dangerous, they can't be trusted, they're rapists, they're criminals, they're terrorists. We are all very aware of the certain racial terminology that are being used by our politicians. I'm not going to call anyone out, but you guys know who I'm talking about. And she essentially says that strategy of using phrases to create this us versus them mentality is still utilized today, just like it was utilized back then. She's about fear over facts, just like how back then people were more concerned about the fear of a certain group of people instead of focusing on the facts. We see that as well being done today. So mainly she speaks about how this us versus them mentality has still allowed for the continued practice of systematic racism. Even if certain minor things have changed, the problem overall is still very much aware. She also goes into if she would make an updated version of this book, some of the things that she would include in this updated version, such as mass deportation, the opioid crisis, the legalization of marijuana. She would go over some of the strengths, weaknesses, and dangers of criminal justice reform that has been done by the Obama administration and the Trump administration. She would go over these certain things, but she decided against actually making an updated version of this book, mainly because she feels that the core thesis of this book is still very much relevant and important now than it was 10 years ago. And essentially what she says is that us reading this book going over today in 2020 allows us to more easily recognize patterns, cycles, and rhetoric which reflect systematic racial injustice. So essentially, she sees this book as a means for us to kind of understand and kind of identify the red flags that were around back then, and use that as a reference to identify red flags that we have now. And she actually had a really powerful quote that I wanted to share with you all. So here's what she says. Rather than attempt to rewrite this book for our present moment, I will let it stand for the moment in which it was written, a moment that has much to teach us about where we are and where we are headed if we fail to face our racial history, our racial present, and our collective future with courage, honesty, and a fierce commitment to honoring and the dignity and value of us all. So a very powerful quote. That basically, we look to this book that was written, again, published in 2010, see the indicators of what was going on back then, realize that history, acknowledge that history, and use that history for us to improve those issues that are still prevalent today in order to have a better future. This is what they said is the mentality that we should have when approaching this book in 2020. And so after that, she goes in, she answers basically two questions, right? Two main questions that may be brought to proponents of this book. So the first question that she answers is, why is the focus of this book on Black men instead of Black Americans in general, including Black women? And so essentially she says that she gives two main reasons as to why her focus in this book was on the mass incarceration of Black men. Her first answer is that due to her expertise and experience, she was primarily exposed to the issues of Black men. She admits that she didn't really have much experience in her profession dealing with unjustly incarcerated Black women, but she acknowledged it's definitely what was there, but she herself just didn't have much exposure to that due to her profession. That's number one. The second reason that she gives is that when it came to the war on drugs, the primary target in this war that she calls it were Black men. They were the primary target. They were the ones who were primarily suffering from that issue at the time. That's what she made her focus on. However, she does acknowledge and go into a little bit of detail as to that it is indeed a very important issue for Black women as well. And there's indeed a mass incarceration problem for Black women. So she gives like two main facts that I felt was important to know. One, of course, is that the incarceration rate for Black women has increased over 800% in the last 30 years. 800%. That's like just ridiculous. And that Black women, of course, are 2 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. And she also mentions that 62% of women who are in prisons have minor children. So thus, due to that their mass incarceration, not only are they suffering, but the children who they leave behind, who many times are forced into foster homes or given to family members who may not want to accept them, thus causing issues for the children as well. And the last thing she says in regards to this question is she shares with the reader some recommended books that we can go into if we're interested, that discuss in detail the issue of incarceration towards Black women. And I'm going to tell you guys some of the books here. She speaks about Andrea Ritchie's Invisible No More, Police Violence Against Black Women and Women of Color. She discussed Becoming Miss Burton, From Prison to Recovery to Leading the Fight of Incarcerated Women by Susan Burton. So she mentions those 3 books as good references for us to learn more about the issue of incarceration of Black women and women of color if we are interested. And those of you who are interested, I can write in the chat for you guys the name of those books if you wanted to look into that. Just inshallah, let me know, and then after we finish, I'll type in those books within the chat. So that's the first question. The second question, and which I feel is a question that's especially relevant today, is the question about what about violent crime? How come she does not discuss violent crime in this book? And this is very important because you'll find today that being one of the biggest arguments against those proponents of this issue of mass incarceration of minorities. You'll see a lot of individuals say, well, you guys are talking about, drug crimes, but that's only just like a small percentage. What about, violent crimes? Most people in prison are like the violent criminals. That's the issue. So it's very important, I think, for us to kind of go over this. So she mainly gives 2 primary answers. The first answer is she wanted to focus attention on the issue of the war on drugs because she felt like this issue was kind of at that particular time, the issue that was causing this mass incarceration problem. She wanted to make sure that we focused our attention on the topic. She wanted to make sure that she had the ability to control the narrative in a way. Because she mentions that almost every time she tries to discuss this issue in a variety of different forums, people always bring up, what about violent crime? What about violent crime? So at that time, she wanted to make sure that she could focus the issue, because as we all know, there's always a time and place for every conversation. So she wanted to make sure with writing this book that she focused our attention on the issue at hand. That's number 1. Number 2 is she feels that the accusation or the proclamation that violent crime is the primary issue, or the primary reason for mass incarceration is simply wrong. And she provides a few facts to back up her claim. She cites a 2010 FBI report which showed that basically out of like most of the arrests that were done were based on non-violent crimes. She also makes a citation of their institute, which showed that in 2019, out of the 10 million individuals who were arrested, only 5% of them were arrested for violent crime. And so she mentions that it's just a fact that a huge majority of people who are arrested are not for violent crimes, it's for non-violent and drug-related crimes, right? And she also responds to a potential rebuttal or towards her claim, and that is that the majority of people who are in state prison today are violent offenders. So how can you say that most people who are incarcerated are non-violent offenders when the majority of people, about 52% in state prison, are violent offenders? So is there anyone that wants to answer that question before I go into what she said? I'll ask it again. How is it possible for Michelle Alexander to say that majority of people who are incarcerated are non-violent offenders when the majority of people in state prison today are violent offenders? What could the answer to that be? Sister Rashidah, go ahead.
Well, I kind of know from reading it, but she mentioned that the length of time that people have to remain in prison when it's a violent crime versus when it's like a drug offense, of course, it's going to be longer for those who have committed a violent crime, and therefore that's why the numbers are so skewed.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly the right answer. And, you know, this makes a lot of sense. And actually, I was really glad to read this because I also myself have heard people say that before. And I myself at that point in time did not really know the answer. But it really makes a lot of sense, right? As we know, typically people who are convicted of a nonviolent crime, their sentences are usually shorter than those with violent crimes, right? So those who are convicted of violent crimes, their sentences will be much longer, which means they're going to be staying in prison longer, right? So you have a group of people who are going through the prison system on a more rapid rate than another group of people. Due to that, it creates this misconception that there are more people who are incarcerated for violent crimes than non-violent crimes because people who committed violent crimes are more plentiful due to the fact that they are staying for longer periods of time. And she uses this fact to essentially refute the claim that due to the fact that there are more people in prison, that more violent criminals in prison than there are non-violent criminals, therefore there's more violent crime. But before she closes in this particular point, she makes a very powerful statement that I wanted to share with you, and that is she kind of challenges our perspective on violent crime. And she says basically, I'm just going to read it to you guys verbatim. We will never close prisons on a large scale in this country or drastically reduce the prison population if we do not change the way we view and respond to violent crime. Now, this is not, inshallah, maybe we can have a more detailed discussion on violent crime or our perspective and response to violent crime. But I think it's important to mention that because it goes into a few different perspectives here. For example, how it's a proven fact that the prison system is not the most efficient way to decrease violent crime. If anything, it increases it. And she discusses how basically some of the best ways to reduce violent crime in communities, of course, is to give larger access to education, jobs, quality of life. She mentions other potential ways to actively respond to violent crime. She basically challenges the way that we as a nation respond to violent crime today. And I think this is a very interesting and important discussion for us to have. Maybe, inshallah ta'ala, at some point we can pass the mic session or some other time we can probably discuss as a group, how our nation establishes justice, and is that really the best way, and what are some other potential ways we can properly respond to these issues. I found that very interesting, and kind of got me to really want to think more about that issue. So, and she says here again, the safest communities are not the ones with the most police, prisons, or electronic monitors, but the ones with quality schools, healthcare, housing, plentiful jobs, and strong social networks that allow families not merely to survive, but to thrive. So again, very powerful quote. So after this, she goes into the way forward. And I want to save our discussion on this particular part of the preface until after we finish the book, because when I was reading through it, I feel that this part, when she thinks about the way forward, it's more of discuss, okay, what do we do now after we read the book? So I think the way forward, what we'll do, that part of the preface, we'll go back to that after we finish actually reading the book, inshallah. And that's essentially where she stops before going into the foreword and the acknowledgement and the introduction. And so those are all the main points I wanted to share with you all today in regards to the 2020 preface. But were there any other parts of the preface that any of us here wanted to share, like Sister Vina, Sister Mary, Sister Rashidah? Were there any other parts in the preface that kind of spoke to you that you thought you wanted to speak about?
Well, you may have already covered this. I've been kind of trying to continue reading. But, you know, she talked about how the majority of those who are incarcerated for drug offenses is actually use of it, as opposed to the actual selling of it or whatever. So it's actually taking people who are addicts and putting them in prison as opposed to giving them treatment. And one of the things she pointed out was that with the opioid crisis, there's been this switch in that kind of mentality. And instead of incarcerating people, they're being treated for the actual addiction that they have. So, and I remember watching some show where that was obvious. It was the police out with actual social workers addressing and approaching people that they knew were on drugs. They actually found drugs on these people. They didn't arrest them. They just encouraged them to get treatment, right? So it just shows that disparity between how, you know, people who were on crack, for example, and how those who are on opioids, the whole different treatment that they're getting. So that's something that stood out to me.
No, definitely. I remember that part. Thank you again for sharing, going into a little bit more detail. And like you mentioned, what she says in that part is essentially that tells the reader to kind of see the difference in behavior. She basically says that once a particular issue, aka the opioid crisis, affects the privileged community, there is a much more different response. It becomes much more of a focused issue on how to respond to it, other than when it's an issue that's facing a minority community. The response is typically much more aggressive, much more violent, much more short term. So,
and I think that kind of speaks to, you know, what we've been talking about as far as humanizing people, right? So, you know, on the one hand, you have people who you view as more human than others, right? And so, again, it takes us back to the dehumanization also of people of color.
No, absolutely. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges and the biggest factors that play into social inequality and racial inequality that we see today. Because, and within the prison system, which I'm sure she also goes through in the book, is we as a society automatically view not just a particular group of people, but those who may have broken the law immediately as less than human. We don't take into consideration possible circumstances or factors that could have caused them to fall into those types of activities. Instead, it's more of you're labeled as a felon, you're automatically considered less than human, even if you have done your time and you have officially, technically paid back your debt to society. Society as a whole does not see you the same way. Society as a whole does not see you as human. It's something that's stuck on you for the rest of your life. So I think this issue of dehumanizing people makes it so much easier for our society and societies all over the world to oppress and just completely mistreat large groups of people. Sister Vina, did you have anything that you wanted to share from the 2020 preface?
Assalamu alaikum. So I actually stepped away for a few minutes to make my salat. So, and I also don't have the Kindle book available because I need Wi-Fi for it, and I'm not in an area where I have Wi-Fi. So I'm just kind of listening tonight and being reminded of what I did read in the book. But next week I'll be more ready to answer or give some comments, inshallah.
Okay, no problem. Is there anyone else that wanted to share something from the 2020 preface? Or if you don't own a copy of the 10th anniversary edition, or if you don't have a copy of the book, is there any thoughts or reflections or questions that you wanted to ask or share in regard to what we went over today?
I better not. Nah.
Okay, Brother Hasib.
Kenneth, I just, I'm not specifically addressing this preface. I have a general question, and we don't have to answer it right now, but this is probably the most important question is that who is responsible for this whole mass incarceration or whatever we call it, prison industry? Who is responsible? Or what groups are responsible for that? I think we put it as a discussion item sometime. We need to discuss that who should we, because it seems like that this is also a question mark, that who are the real people who are making these decisions, who make those policies, and who are continuing it. So
I think it's a very good question, Brother Hasib. A very good question. And I think hopefully, inshallah ta'ala, once we start reading the book, I don't know if it'll directly answer the question, but I think it can help us kind of gain a better perspective in order for us to try and better identify the answer to that question. I think it's a very good question. Is there anyone else that wanted to share a thought or reflection from what we went over today?
Assalamu alaikum. Because I don't know how to get through my Kindle, also to look back but I feel very ignorant on the subject. In fact, I didn't even know Jim Crow. I thought this is a person who made laws back in the day. I didn't even I'm really ignorant with this, and so I'm just I'm learning a lot, I guess. But I feel really ignorant in this topic. And so I just I'm mostly here just to listen, maybe, and to learn, because I don't have much knowledge on this stuff.
And that's perfectly fine, sister. That's absolutely perfectly fine. We're all, at least myself especially, ignorant on this. That's why we're going to be reading this book together, so we can all learn more about these issues and be more educated on them. So that's definitely no problem. We're all here learning together. So thank you for that. Anyone else? Jeffrey, you wanted to say something?
Oh, how did you know I was going to say something?
Because I heard you.
I didn't know my mic was on.
It's on, brother. It's on.
Oh, is it? Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I just was thinking of the last comment, and this is not a reflection on anybody, but that's a whole part of what American society is if I'm not impacted, you see it, we all see it, because it's a part of our culture. This Jim Crow, the separation of classes, of people or races, you cannot help but to see it in this country. You may not acknowledge it, but you see it every day. You're impacted by this system of racism that this country is based on every day. To I don't see it or I don't know it, that's because you're walking around with your hand, and it's not attacking anybody. This is just how we are in America. You're walking around with your hand in front of your eyes because it is in front of you every day, whether you're Black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever you're, Indian. And it really stems going back as far as, I was doing a speech in this in my Toastmasters group, how we talk about slavery and what drove this. Because in the late 1600s or the early 17th century, when imperialism or colonization was prevalent, and the big dollar item was sugarcane and cotton, Europeans and Africans, even in the early part of slavery, they were working in this country together. It wasn't until Europeans and Africans as laborers decided to say, well, you know what? I don't like working 18 hours a day and not getting a fair wage and not getting a part of getting a just wage for my labor. That's when this thing that we call, not that it's evolved into Jim Crow, but it was definitely a separation of labor based on color. I did one of the speeches I did was by a professor, one of these Harvard professors, James Woods, and he talks about the birth of slavery or racism in America based on one, labor, the division of labor. Because like I said, in the 1600s, Europeans and African slaves were working in the same fields. They were intermarrying, they were running away from each other. It's just that the Europeans, after they called it indentured servitude, after the Europeans say, well, wait a minute, I didn't work my 3 years or 5 years, or whatever. I want my 40 acres or my 50 acres. I want greater wages. Well, that's a threat. That was a threat, obviously, to the rich landowners or plantation owners. And believe me, interracial marriages just didn't happen in the 20th century. They've been doing it ever since a man could see a woman that was cute, regardless of her color. They were interracially marrying or intermingling. But when it comes time to protect money and property, that's when this division started in this country. The guy's written this book. I'll get the name of the book, but it's on Amazon. But this is really the basis of this Jim Crow, really the basis of how so much of this started. And then, of course, it has evolved over the last 400 or 500 years. But I've read Dr. Alexander's book. So I'm gonna have to get a new copy, probably a couple of years ago or greater. And when you take a person's labor force away from him, he's got to figure out how to get it back. And to get it back was to come up with ideas on, well, I'm going to incarcerate them, and then once they're getting in jail, once I've had them incarcerated, I could just buy them from the state. And I can just buy his or her labor from the state, which is what was called contract labor, which is what we see in the 20th century as mass incarceration, because you can take these prisoners and you could use their labor for little or nothing to make whatever products and provide whatever services that we need for the rich and famous to have. Okay, I'm done with that. But to say that you don't see it, you see Jim Crow, you see this bigotry and racism and division between cultures and races and classes in this country. You see it. You may not want to admit it or admit that it's in front of you, but you see it. You cannot see it because it's in front of your face. Each one of our faces every day. White, black, green, purple is in your face. Don't say you don't see it, because it's hitting you in the face every day. And that's all I'm going to say on that.
Right. First, I don't think everyone was saying that they don't see it or acknowledge it, Brother Jeffrey.
You got to acknowledge it because it's here. Whether
I
you
don't
like
think,
it, dislike it, it's in your face.
I think basically, there was some of us may not know all those the specific facts which led us to these issues. I think is the main thing here. And I first want to say thank you for sharing that with us about the Europeans and the Africans. That was very interesting facts. And maybe inshallah ta'ala one day you can give a halaqah about that and educate us more on the origin of Jim Crow, inshallah. But is there anyone else that wanted to share something before we close? Sister Rashidah.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that really stood out to me that she said was, we're not just talking about those who are behind bars, right? And we're not just talking about them when they are behind bars. We're talking about how they're stigmatized, how a lot of their rights are taken from them after they've been released, you know, as far as trying to find a job, trying to find a place to live, even trying to get, you know, public assistance, et cetera, that they're still, you know, treated as if they're, you know, still behind bars, in other words. And not only for them, because if you can imagine that this person has a family, then that means that the family is helping to support that person because they're unable to find gainful employment, et cetera, in an effort to try to get them most likely not to return to prison by having to do some things that are illegal because they can't find legal means to take care of themselves and their families. So it's just like a cycle that's perpetuated against the person, even after they've quote unquote served their time. And it's not, again, just them that's impacted, but their families as well. So I just wanted to add that.
Jazakallah khair for adding that. I forgot to mention that point. I feel bad for that because actually it was a very, very important point. And kind of like a major factor within the book itself is that the most damaging aspect of these mass incarcerations is not that these people are being locked up, it's the aftermath. You know, we're going to be learning, inshallah ta'ala, how having that title on you, felon, for the rest of your life, how many obstacles that puts on you, how many doors are closed for you, making it essentially putting you in permanent second-class status, right? So while even though you have technically, again, paid your debt to society is still punishing you. And how these certain drug laws that were passed would be harsher towards a specific group of people over another, cause even further deterioration of lower income and vulnerable communities. So thank you, Sister Rashidah, for mentioning that. I forgot to mention that point, which is a very, very important point that she mentioned. So we're going to be learning more of it, inshallah. All right, we have time for one more comment. If there was someone who wanted to share one more comment or reflection.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Brother Sajid. How are you, Kenneth?
Wa alaikum assalam. We're doing good now that I can hear your voice, Brother Sajid.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, man. Allah bless you, inshallah. I just caught some of the last couple of statements, and I caught where the brother was asking the question about, you know, who's responsible for this, you know, mass incarceration and the system, and some of the other comments after that. So I just wanted to chime in and say that, you know, part of the issue with mass incarceration is that, you know, like any other business, you got to have product in order for it to be successful. So when you look at the privatization of the prison system, you got to look at who really benefits from that. And, you know, when I used to go and do groups in the prison or outside the prison with individuals, whether they be addicts or drug dealers, one of the things that I tried to get across to them is that, you know, see yourself as a product. that people are making money off of. So one of the groups or the systems in place that's responsible for mass incarceration, I believe it's business. It's people who privately invest in the prison system, and you got to have products. So they're the ones that are lobbying and making the laws, and anything that you buy in prison, somebody's getting paid. You know, whether it's a brand new see-through TV that costs you $80-90 every time you go in, somebody's getting paid for that, whether it's the toilet tissue. So some of that responsibility lies on those who are invested in the privatization of the prison system. I did a study of, in the state of Connecticut, we had somewhere around about 23 to 24,000 people incarcerated in our prison systems. At that time, it was about $33,000 to incarcerate somebody for a year. I did a study with 100 men. So I was doing a men's group. And I had them, from various reasons, I had them to write down all the time that they spent in the prison system. How many years have you spent in the prison system? And how many times have you been arrested? So to make it short, out of 100 men, we had over 800 years of incarceration added up together, just from 100 men. Now, earlier I said we housed about 23 to 24,000. So we had 800 plus years of incarceration and over 23,000 arrests. And you times that 800 by 33, and you see what the number comes up to house somebody in prison for 1 year. So it's a big business. And so there are laws to make sure that they have product. And so, you know, that's one of the reasons why you have that problem with the prison systems. The other thing is that I think some people are just unconscious to the reality of what is going on around them sometimes. I don't think that it's anybody's fault or anybody does it on purpose. I think sometimes we are just blinded by our pictures, and until we surrender those pictures through way of being taught or being able to come to a place where we begin to see things a little bit differently. I mean, we're now in a time where a lot of eyes are being opened up, and so I don't, know if it's, somebody is choosing not to see it. I just think it's just sometimes we have these mistaken beliefs that, until we're challenged, it's just the way that we see things unconsciously. I don't think anybody consciously would. Well, I won't say that. I won't go there. But anyway, that's my response. I wanted to respond to that.
Oh, that was a very great response, Brother Sajid. Yeah. Actually, what you just said about how we're purposely made blind to some of these things reminds me of a quote that she actually has here. And I'll share that quote with you guys. I don't know if I shared this quote with you guys yet, but she said, "Every system of injustice depends on silence, paralysis, confusion, and cooperation of those it seeks to eliminate or control." So essentially, kind of similar to what you were saying, Brother Sajid, I think another major factor of those responsible are those who either willingly or unwillingly turn a blind eye to this issue. And so hence why we're having these discussions, educating ourselves on these issues, so that not just to talk about them, so that way we can talk about the next step. What can we do to address these issues? Because as we've discussed in many different Embrace platforms or programs, it is our responsibility as Muslims to stand up for justice. And so it's very important in order for us to do that, to be educated on the injustices that are going on in this country. So with that, I think we can go ahead and close. So inshallah ta'ala, next week we'll be starting the introduction portion of the book. It's only about 20 or so pages, so it shouldn't be that hard to read. Again, I encourage all of you to purchase the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. You can buy it for just $10 off Amazon Kindle if you want the Kindle version. The hard copy version, of course, is a little bit more expensive, and I think that they're out of stock, so they may be in stock now. But I heavily encourage all of you to purchase the book. That way, you can join in on the conversation with us and share with us your thoughts and reflections on the book itself. And so, with that, before I close, just a few announcements. So this Friday, inshallah, we're going to be having our new monthly program, the Embrace documentary watch party. And the documentary we're going to be watching this Friday is White Helmets. It's a documentary that discusses the conflicts going on in Syria, kind of give us a perspective from those who are on the ground helping out, volunteering to help out those in need. We're going to be starting, I believe, 7:30 Central Time, so that'll be 8:30 Eastern Time. Saturday, we're going to be having our monthly Pass the Mic session. It's going to be moderated by our own Chef, Jesse McKenzie, as well as our brother, Inti Top. The topic for this one is going to be quarantine woes, the social isolation of converts. We're going to be discussing essentially, as it says, how the quarantine has affected us, as well as how social isolation affects converts in general, even outside of COVID. So if you want to share your experiences, your thoughts, some of your challenges with us, please join us on Saturday. It's going to be from 2 to 4 Central Time, 3 to 5 Eastern Time. And then finally, Sunday, we're going to be having our new Brothers program. So we finally are launching a Brothers Only bi-weekly chat. It's going to be done from 7 o'clock Central Time, 8 o'clock Eastern Time. It's going to be a very casual setting for brothers just to talk and bond and learn about each other and speak about a variety of different topics that are especially relevant and important to brothers. So we're going to be starting this Sunday. I encourage all of you who are brothers to join in, learn with us, bond with us, have fun with us. Inshallah, it should be a nice, casual, fun discussion. And so with that, we'll go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullahu khairan, wassalamu alaikum.